Keeper Valthrin had worked at the Galactic Archives for 300 cycles, and he had seen many things in his long career as a record keeper. His species, the Krell, were famous across all the known worlds for being patient and careful with details, and they could look at huge amounts of information without getting emotional about it, which made them perfect for keeping track of history. When the Archive Council told him to study and write down everything about the military history of a newly discovered species called humanity, he said yes, without thinking twice, because this seemed like any other job he had done before. The humans had just learned how to travel faster than light, and they had entered galactic society recently with curious eyes and careful steps. Most young species were peaceful when they joined the galaxy, because they had unified their home planets through talking and working together, rather than fighting. Valthrin thought humanity would be the same as all the others, so he set up his research station in orbit around Earth and turned on his translation computers and started downloading all the historical records that humans had kept over their existence. The first war he looked at was very old, and it was between ancient city-states fighting over land and water and resources. This was normal for primitive civilizations, and Valthrin had seen it 1,000 times before in his studies of other species. But as he went deeper into the record, something strange started to appear in the data. Humanity had never stopped fighting, and there was not a single generation without war, and not even a single decade of complete peace. The wars had different names and different reasons and different weapons, but they never ever stopped. Valthrin felt his primary appendages start to shake as he understood how big this was. There was the 100 Years' War and the 30 Years' War and the Napoleonic Wars and World War I and World War II in Korea and Vietnam, and the list went on and on like a chain that never broke, spanning thousands of years. These were just the big conflicts, and between them were countless smaller wars and civil fights and revolutions and insurgencies that filled every gap in the timeline. What bothered him most was not how many wars there were, but how humans fought in them. Other species fought wars with careful planning, and they tried to reduce damage and save resources for later use. Humans fought with an intensity that made no logical sense, and they threw themselves into battles they could not win, and they made weapons that could destroy their entire planet, and they sacrificed millions of their own kind for ideas that had no physical form, like freedom and honor and revenge. Lieutenant Danny Hayes showed up in one of the old records from a conflict called World War II, and Valthrin watched the footage of Hayes flying his last mission, with his aircraft damaged and burning. The human could have jumped out with a parachute to save himself, but he refused to leave his wingmen alone even as his controls stopped working. He stayed at his position and kept firing his guns to protect the other pilots until his plane went spinning down into the ocean, and his last words over the radio were calm and almost casual when he said, "Tell my brother I kept my promise." Valthrin stopped the recording and sat very still for a long time. In 300 cycles of keeping records, he had never found a species that valued loyalty to non-relatives over their own survival. The Krell had strong social bonds with each other, but staying alive always came first, no matter what. Yet this human had chosen certain death to protect others who were not even related to him by blood or any genetic connection that would make sense. He kept going with his research, thinking that maybe Hayes was just one strange case, but he was not strange at all. The pattern repeated over and over across centuries and cultures and continents. There were Japanese pilots in the Pacific and German soldiers at Stalingrad, and American Marines at Iwo Jima, and British infantry in muddy trenches. Every single conflict showed humans throwing themselves at death with a determination that looked like insanity from the outside. As the first week of research ended, Valthrin put together his first report, and his appendages moved slowly across the data interface, which was a sign of deep worry in his species. The Archive Council would want to know if humanity was dangerous to galactic peace. But how could he explain what he was finding? How could he make them understand that humanity's greatest strength and most scary weakness were exactly the same thing? They simply did not know how to quit, and they did not know when to stop fighting. This was in their nature at some fundamental level that Valthrin could observe but not yet understand. He had documented the rise and fall of empires that lasted millions of years, and civilizations that spanned entire star clusters, but none of them had shown this particular quality. Other species fought when they needed to and stopped when logic said to stop, but humans fought until they won or until they died, and sometimes they kept fighting. Even after death seemed certain, the data kept piling up on his screens, and Valthrin realized this assignment was going to be different from anything he had done before. Humanity was an anomaly in galactic history, and he was the one who had to figure out what that meant for everyone else. The weight of that responsibility settled on him like a heavy blanket, and for the first time in his long career he felt something close to dread about what he might discover next. He looked out at Earth spinning below his station with its blue oceans and white clouds and green continents. Down there on that small planet were billions of humans living their lives and raising families and going to work. And they had no idea that an alien was up here studying their bloodiest moments. They did not know that their entire species was being evaluated and judged and recorded for all of galactic history too. Valthrin turned back to his screens and opened the next file in the massive database of human warfare. There was so much more to see and understand and document. He had barely scratched the surface of humanity's military history, and already he felt overwhelmed by what he was learning. The next file loaded and showed soldiers marching across a frozen landscape with determination in their eyes, despite the cold and hunger and fear. He took a deep breath through his breathing spiracles and began to read. 3 months passed since Valthrin started his research, and he stopped taking rest cycles completely. Sleep had become impossible because his mind kept replaying the images and sounds of human warfare, even when he closed his sensory organs. The Krell body could stay awake for long periods without major damage, but his colleagues at the archive started noticing changes in his behavior. His usually short and precise reports grew longer and more detailed and almost obsessive in their focus. He had moved past simple historical documentation and started doing psychological analysis instead. What was it about humanity that made them fight with such intensity and rage? Other species made weapons too, but humans weaponized absolutely everything they touched. They turned farm chemicals into explosives and civilian airplanes into bombers, and medical research into biological weapons. And when their technology failed, they used rocks and sticks, and when those failed, they used their bare hands and teeth. Captain Lisa Grant's story showed this tendency perfectly. During the Mars Colony Rebellion, her ship had been badly damaged by reactor problems and life support was failing, and all ammunition was gone. Standard military rules for any galactic species would have meant immediate surrender to save lives. Grant instead took the dying reactor's energy and turned it into one massive electromagnetic pulse that disabled the enemy vessels, while at the same time venting her own ship's atmosphere into space. She and her crew sealed themselves in emergency suits and floated in the void for 6 days before rescue ships arrived. And 2 crew members died from suit failures, but Grant's official report contained only 5 words about her decision, and those words were surrender was not an option. Valthrin discovered that this phrase appeared throughout human military history in many different forms. They said things like, "I have not yet begun to fight," and they said nuts when asked to surrender, and they said they shall not pass, and we will fight them on the beaches. Humanity had created an entire vocabulary devoted to the concept of refusing defeat no matter what the circumstances looked like. He started examining the wars humanity fought against itself, hoping to find some weakness in their psychology, but instead he found something much worse. Civil wars were the most brutal and violent of all their conflicts. Brothers fought against brothers, and parents fought against children, and friends killed friends. The American Civil War alone had killed more Americans than all of America's other wars combined up to that point. They did not just fight outsiders with determination, but they fought each other with the exact same unwavering commitment and refusal to quit. The Vietnam War records troubled him more deeply than almost anything else. The United States had been the most powerful military force on Earth at that time, and they had eventually withdrawn from the conflict. Valthrin thought he had finally found evidence of some reasonable limitation to human aggression and willingness to fight. Then he read the accounts from the North Vietnamese perspective and found something that disturbed him greatly. General Nguyen Pham had written in his personal journal that the Americans brought tremendous firepower and technology, but we brought time and blood, and we knew they would eventually leave, but we also knew we would never stop. And if this war lasted 100 years, we would fight. For 100 years, both sides had been willing to fight indefinitely and without end. The Americans had left not because they could not win militarily, but because their own people back home had demanded an end to the bloodshed. Humanity could defeat humanity, but only barely, and only by turning their own relentless nature against themselves, which was a disturbing thought. Valthrin's research showed another worrying pattern. Humanity's wars were becoming more efficient and more devastating and more total as time went on. They went from swords to rifles to nuclear weapons in just a few thousand years, which was incredibly fast. Most species took millions of years to develop such destructive capability, and by then they had evolved beyond the psychological need to use it. Humans had developed the power to destroy themselves long before they developed the wisdom to hold back from using that power. He found footage of the atomic bombings in 1945. The mushroom clouds rising over Hiroshima and Nagasaki looked like the end of the world, and the shadows burned into walls where people had been standing showed the incredible heat and destruction. In the aftermath, humanity had looked at what they had created, and for a brief moment they hesitated, but they did not get rid of their weapons and they did not step back from the edge. Instead, they built more weapons, and bigger weapons and faster weapons until they had enough nuclear devices to destroy their own planet dozens of times over. The Cold War period fascinated and horrified him in equal measure. Two superpowers had aimed civilization-ending arsenals at each other for decades, operating under a doctrine they called mutually assured destruction. And the acronym was MAD, which Valthrin learned was also a human word meaning insane. The humans themselves recognized the insanity of their situation, but they maintained it anyway because, in their way of thinking, the threat of total annihilation was better than appearing weak to their enemies. Commander Ryan Blake had been a nuclear submarine captain during the Cold War's final years, and his vessel carried ballistic missiles with each one, capable of destroying an entire city. Valthrin found Blake's personal logs that were written during long patrols beneath the Arctic ice, and in one entry Blake had written that we sleep, knowing that if the order comes we will end millions of lives without hesitation, and we pray the order never comes, but if it does we will not hesitate because this is the burden we accepted when we volunteered for this duty. Volunteered? They had volunteered to potentially commit genocide against millions of innocent people. This was beyond Valthrin's ability to understand on any logical level. The Krell had automated their defense system specifically to remove such terrible decisions from individual consciousness, because no single mind should carry that weight. Yet humans gave these decisions to individuals, knowing the psychological cost because they believed some choices required a human conscience no matter how heavy the burden. Valthrin had stopped eating regularly, and his colleagues kept expressing concern, but he dismissed them every time. He had to understand what made humans this way, and he had to document everything properly. The Archive Council was waiting for his complete report, but how could he submit incomplete work when every answer led to a dozen new questions? Why did humanity fight so hard? Where did this relentless drive come from? And most troubling of all, what would happen when this species fully entered galactic society, bringing their particular brand of determination and refusal to quit with them into a galaxy that had been peaceful for 10,000 years? He needed more data and more understanding, but the more he learned, the less he felt he truly understood. Humans were a paradox wrapped in flesh and bone, and they carried contradictions inside themselves that would break any logical analysis. They were capable of incredible kindness and terrible cruelty, often from the same individual and sometimes in the same day. Valthrin looked at his reflection in the dark screen and barely recognized himself anymore. 6 months into his assignment, Valthrin made a discovery that changed everything about how he understood humanity. He had been looking through Earth's evolutionary history, trying to find the biological roots of human aggression and violence. What he found was not a species designed for war, but a species designed for survival, against absolutely impossible odds. Early humans had been weak by almost every physical measure. They had no claws or fangs or natural weapons of any kind. They could not run faster than predators, and they had no armor plating on their skin, and they produced no toxins or poisons. By every logical measure, Homo sapiens should have gone extinct within a few generations because they were prey for countless species that were stronger and faster and better armed for combat. But humans had two critical advantages. That made all the difference. They had intelligence, and they had an absolute refusal to accept extinction as their fate. When predators hunted them, they developed tools to fight back. When ice ages threatened to freeze them, they learned to make and control fire. When starvation loomed over their tribes, they domesticated plants and animals. Every environmental challenge and every natural disaster and every brush with extinction only made their determination to survive even stronger. War was not an aberration in human psychology. Valthurin realized with growing dread. War was just an extension of their core survival mechanism. They approached conflict the same way they approached every other existential threat in their history, with tool-making, ingenuity, and social cooperation, and an unwavering refusal to accept defeat. He found records of a siege at a place called Leningrad during World War II. The German military had surrounded the city and cut off all supply lines, trying to starve the population into submission. The siege lasted 872 days, and over 1 million civilians died from starvation and cold and disease. Yet the city never surrendered to the enemy. Residents ate leather and wallpaper paste and anything remotely organic to stay alive. They took apart buildings for firewood during winters that reached -40 degrees. The city's symphony orchestra performed a concert in the middle of the siege, even though they were starving and freezing, and they broadcast the music through loudspeakers facing the enemy lines. It served no tactical purpose, and it was not practical, but it sent a message that said, "We are still here and we still exist, and you cannot break us, Sergeant." Amy Collins had served in the Middle Eastern conflicts of the early 21st century. Her convoy had been ambushed and her vehicle was disabled, and half her squad was dead or wounded. Standard procedure was to call for evacuation and defend the position until help arrived. Instead, Collins organized her surviving soldiers and rigged the disabled vehicle with explosives and led a fighting retreat through hostile territory for 8 miles on foot. When asked later why she did not wait for rescue, she said, "The enemy thought they had us pinned down, and I was not about to prove them right." This attitude went through every level of human military culture, from the lowest private to the highest general. Entire nations demonstrated it when faced with overwhelming force. Finland had held off the Soviet Union in the Winter War despite being outnumbered 100 to 1 in tanks and aircraft. The defenders wore white camouflage and skied through frozen forests armed with rifles and improvised explosives, and they fought the Red Army to a complete standstill. They had no logical chance of victory according to any military analysis, so they simply refused to acknowledge the logic. Valthurin began looking at humanity's peacetime achievements with new understanding. The same relentless determination they brought to war, they brought to absolutely everything else. They split the atom and cured diseases that had killed millions and built machines that could think, and they went to their moon not because it was easy, as one of their leaders had famously said, but specifically because it was hard. Lieutenant Colonel Barry Foster had led the first manned mission to Jupiter's moons, which was a journey that took 3 years, round trip in cramped living quarters with minimal supplies and constant danger. When reporters asked him about the psychological strain, he had laughed and said, "My grandfather stormed a beach under machine gun fire, and my grandmother survived cancer twice, and my parents came to America with nothing but a suitcase and hope, so spending 3 years in a tin can looking at the greatest sight in the solar system is not sacrifice, but privilege." Every human alive carried this legacy in their genes. They were all descendants of survivors, and each generation had overcome some catastrophic challenge. Ice ages and plagues and famines and wars and natural disasters. Humanity's entire history was basically a catalog of near extinctions that they survived through sheer stubborn refusal to die. But Valthurin's growing understanding brought him no comfort at all. The Archive Council needed to know what this species would become when they were freed from their gravity. Well, what would they do when given access to galactic resources and technology? What would happen when they faced not natural disasters or each other, but truly alien civilizations with different values and different ways of thinking? The galaxy had been at peace for 10,000 years. This peace was maintained through careful diplomacy and mutual trade agreements and the general understanding that war was illogical and wasteful. The great species of the galaxy had evolved beyond such primitive competition, and they had learned that cooperation was more efficient than conflict. In every measurable way, humans would enter this peaceful galaxy carrying the survival instinct of a species that had clawed its way to sentience through countless near extinctions. They would bring their incomprehensible tenacity and their refusal to accept defeat and their willingness to sacrifice absolutely anything to achieve their goals. Valthurin looked at records of humanity's recent first contact scenarios with other species. In every single case, humans had approached alien encounters with weapons ready, not because they wanted conflict, but because their entire history had taught them to prepare for the worst possible outcome. Admiral Patricia Hayes, who commanded humanity's first interstellar diplomatic Mission had written in her reports that we hope for peace, but we prepare for war, and we never assume the universe owes us kindness. The galaxy was completely unprepared for this mindset. The established civilizations had grown comfortable in their long peace. They had reduced their militaries to token ceremonial forces because they viewed defense as an outdated concept. Conflict was resolved through arbitration councils and trade negotiations. Violence was so incredibly rare that most species had developed cultural taboos against it. Humans had no such taboos built into their psychology. They had rules of war and ethical guidelines and moral frameworks. But these were pragmatic restrictions, not fundamental prohibitions. A human could commit violence and feel terrible guilt about it and seek forgiveness and then do it again if circumstances demanded. Guilt did not stop them, and horror did not stop them, and nothing stopped them except death or victory, and sometimes not even death. Valthrin's appendages shook constantly now as he compiled this section of his report. He was beginning to understand a terrible truth. Humanity was not a threat to galactic peace because they were naturally aggressive. They were a threat because they were survivors, and survivors did whatever was necessary to continue surviving no matter the cost. 9 months into his research, Valthrin experienced his first cognitive fracture, which should not have been possible. The Krell were not supposed to be capable of psychological trauma because their neural architecture was too stable and too logical, yet he found himself unable to process certain human concepts without experiencing something his medical scans could only describe as severe distress. He had begun studying humanity's concept of sacrifice and particularly how humans processed the knowledge that their actions might require their own death. Other species understood self-sacrifice in very limited contexts, like protecting offspring or preserving genetic legacy or ensuring species continuation. These were biological imperatives that were instinctive and completely understandable from an evolutionary perspective. Human sacrifice operated on entirely different logic that made no biological sense. They died for complete strangers, and they died for abstract ideas, and they died for countries that had only existed for a few centuries. They died for principles that had no genetic basis whatsoever. And they did all of this knowing that death was final and their consciousness would end forever because humans had no definitive proof of an afterlife despite their various religious beliefs. Private Kyle Brown had thrown himself on a grenade during the Pacific theater of World War II and used his body to shield 3 other soldiers from the blast. He was 19 years old, and he had known exactly what would happen when he made that choice. The other soldiers survived because of him, and Brown's last words, according to witnesses, were simply, "Get down." There were thousands of such incidents scattered throughout human history. Soldiers running into burning buildings to save people, pilots deliberately ramming their damaged planes into enemy vessels, medics staying with wounded soldiers under heavy fire, ship captains going down with their vessels to save passengers. Each instance represented a conscious choice to die so that others might live. Valthrin could document these events in his reports, but he could not understand them on any fundamental level. The Krell survived as a species by being logical and rational. Humans survived by being willing to sacrifice logic itself when emotional imperatives demanded it. He discovered a human military award called the Medal of Honor that had been established during their Civil War. Nearly half of all recipients had died in the actions that earned them the medal. The citation was always similar in wording, and it talked about conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of life above and beyond the call of duty. Above and beyond the call of duty meant doing more than was rationally required, and humans had formalized this concept into their military culture. Dr. Jennifer Cole had been a civilian physician working with a military hospital unit in Afghanistan. When her base came under attack, she had refused evacuation and continued operating on wounded soldiers even as explosions rocked the building around her. She died when the structure collapsed on top of her, but her final surgery had been successful. The soldier she saved went on to have 3 children, and Cole had no children of her own. The mathematics made absolutely no sense from a genetic perspective. One life traded for one life, with potential future generations favoring the soldier. But Cole's choice was celebrated as heroic rather than foolish. Humans valued the choice itself and the conscious decision to place another person's survival above their own, regardless of any genetic, calculus, or evolutionary benefit. Valthrin began experiencing rest cycle nightmares, which was another thing Krell were not supposed to have. He dreamed of human soldiers marching endlessly through fire with their bodies burning, but their formations never breaking. He dreamed of nuclear explosions blooming across Earth like deadly flowers. He dreamed of Captain Lisa Grant floating in space with her oxygen running out, but still refusing to surrender. His colleagues at the archive insisted he take mandatory rest periods, but he refused their demands. There was too much work left to complete, and he had to document everything properly. Future generations needed to understand what humanity was and what they represented and what kind of influence they would have on the ordered galaxy. But threat was the wrong word, and Valthrin knew it even as he kept using it in his reports. Humans were not a threat in the traditional sense. They were a catalyst and an unknown variable and a species that did not fit any existing framework for understanding civilized behavior. He studied the human concept of heroism more deeply and found it deeply disturbing to his logical mind. Heroes were not the strongest individuals or the smartest individuals. They were the ones who refused to quit when logic demanded surrender. They were the ones who stood and fought when standing was suicide. They were the ones who kept fighting when fighting was completely futile. Humanity celebrated failure as long as that failure came with maximum effort and refusal to give up. Commander Jack Perry had been a test pilot for humanity's early space program. His experimental craft had suffered catastrophic systems failure during re-entry into Earth's atmosphere. Perry could have ejected safely, but the craft would have crashed into a heavily populated area. He rode the disintegrating spacecraft down and used its dying control systems to steer it toward empty desert. The crash was visible for 50 miles in all directions, and Perry's last transmission was not a goodbye but technical data describing the craft's failure mode so future pilots might avoid his fate. The data Perry transmitted was incredibly valuable for the space program, and Perry was dead. Humans considered this a worthwhile trade. They built monuments to people like Perry, and they taught their children these stories, and they created an entire cultural framework celebrating those who chose duty over survival. Valthrin reviewed his own species' history looking for comparison. The Krell had evolved on a stable world with abundant resources. They had developed slowly and carefully without the constant pressure of near-extinction events. They had built their civilization on logic and patience and careful planning. They had no concept of heroic sacrifice because they had no evolutionary pressure to develop one. Humanity had evolved in what could only be described as a crucible. Every single generation had faced some existential threat that could have ended them. Survival demanded cooperation and innovation and occasionally the willingness to die so others could continue. Those traits had been reinforced over hundreds of thousands of years until they became fundamental to human psychology at the deepest level. The species that entered the galaxy now seemed peaceful and unified and curious. They had achieved post-scarcity economics and developed clean energy and cured most diseases. They seemed eager to learn from older civilizations and contribute to galactic society. But underneath that peaceful exterior, Valthrin knew with absolute certainty lay the same unbreakable core that had carried humanity through countless near extinctions. If threatened, they would fight, and if outmatched, they would adapt, and if defeated, they would rise again. And they would do all of this with a determination that no other galactic species could match or even comprehend. His report was supposed to be objective and analytical, but Valthrin found himself writing warnings between the lines, not because humans were evil or naturally aggressive, but because they were survivors, and survival sometimes required terrible choices. The galaxy's other species had forgotten how to make those choices because they had evolved beyond the need for such primitive thinking. Humans had not forgotten, and could not forget, and would not forget. The cognitive fracture in Valthrin's mind widened further, and he stopped sleeping entirely. 12 months after beginning his research, Valthrin completed his report, and it ran to 3,000 pages, making it the longest document he had ever produced in his entire career. The Archive Council would need weeks to review it fully and properly. But buried deep in those pages was a conclusion he could not bring himself to write explicitly because the truth was too terrible to state in direct language. The galaxy was not prepared for humanity, and not because humans would conquer or destroy, but because they would inspire something far more dangerous. They would remind the ancient species of what they had forgotten over millions of years of peaceful evolution. Valthrin had expanded his research beyond humanity to review the histories of other galactic civilizations with fresh perspective. Every single one had evolved through conflict before reaching their current peaceful state. The Krell had fought brutal territorial wars in their distant past. The Xenothari had nearly destroyed themselves in religious conflicts that lasted centuries. The Vormix had practiced ritual combat until they developed beyond it. Every species had been violent once upon a time. Every species had fought for survival and resources and dominance, but millions of years of evolution and thousands of years of unbroken peace had gentled them all. They had grown comfortable and safe and soft. Humanity was a mirror reflecting what they had all once been, and when the other species looked at humans, they would remember their own forgotten histories. They would remember what it felt like to fight for survival. They would remember the thrill of competition and the satisfaction of victory and the desperation of struggle. Some would be horrified by these memories, and some would be fascinated, and some Valthrin feared would be inspired to reclaim what they had lost. He had discovered evidence of this process already beginning in small ways. Young members of various species were seeking out human cultural products, including their music and their stories, and their competitive games. Human sports had become surprisingly popular in certain sectors, especially the violent contact competitions that other species had abandoned millennia ago. Human military history was being studied, not just by archivists like himself, but by ordinary civilians who were curious about their own species' warrior pasts. Captain Sam Rogers had visited the Krell homeworld as part of a cultural exchange program. He gave a lecture on human military history, expecting perhaps a dozen academics to attend. 3,000 young Krell showed up to hear him speak. Rogers showed them footage of human soldiers fighting against impossible odds, and when the lecture ended, the questions lasted for 6 hours. How do you maintain morale when defeat seems certain? What drives humans to sacrifice themselves for abstract principles? Can courage be taught, or is it inherent to your species? The questions had disturbed Rogers, according to his personal log. Not because they were hostile, but because they were hungry. The young Krell wanted to understand not just human behavior, but the possibility of their own capacity for such behavior. Valthrin had witnessed this phenomenon himself at the archive. Younger staff members lingered over the human records and spent their free time reviewing battles and conflicts. They were fascinated by the drama and intensity of human warfare. Even though they had no personal context for such violence, they were drawn to it the way a safe person might be drawn to stand at the edge of a dangerous cliff. Humanity was not going to conquer the galaxy through military might. They were going to conquer it through cultural contamination, by reintroducing concepts that the galaxy had spent millions of years evolving beyond: competition and aggression and struggle and victory. His report contained all the factual data, but not this conclusion. He could not write it explicitly because the Archive Council would demand he prove it, and he could not prove something that had not yet happened. He could only feel its inevitability the way a weather predictor might sense an approaching storm before any instruments detected it. The galaxy had existed in stable peace for 10,000 years because all the civilized species had forgotten how to fight and lost the desire to do so. Humanity remembered and humanity desired, and contact with humanity would reawaken dormant instincts in species that had evolved beyond them. Lieutenant Nicole Bennett had asked him a direct question during an interview session at the archive. She was part of the human diplomatic corps assigned to help with cultural integration. Young and brilliant and earnest, she looked at him with those disturbingly direct human eyes and asked, "Do we scare you?" Valthrin had hesitated with his appendages freezing mid-motion and said, "Your species is unexpected." "That is not an answer," Bennett had replied with a smile that did not reach her serious eyes. "I have read the preliminary reports from other species about us, and fear is a common theme. They are afraid we will start wars and break the peace and disrupt 10,000 years of stability." She paused and then added, "They are not entirely wrong to be afraid." "You acknowledge your species' capacity for violence?" Valthrin had asked. "Of course," Bennett said, leaning forward. "But that is not why they should be afraid. They should be afraid because they have forgotten how to struggle. And struggle is what makes life meaningful. They have optimized everything and solved every problem and eliminated every challenge, and in doing so, they have eliminated purpose." "Peace is not purposeful?" Valthrin had asked. "Peace is wonderful and peace is necessary," Bennett answered. "But peace without the capacity for struggle is just existence. It is waiting and maintaining and nothing more. We fought for hundreds of thousands of years just to survive another day. And that desperation and that need and that refusal to quit is burned into our DNA. We cannot turn it off, and we do not want to turn it off." Valthrin had not known how to respond to that. Bennett had articulated exactly what he had been thinking, but could not bring himself to write in his official report. "We are going to change your galaxy," Bennett continued, "not through war but through example. We are going to show everyone that life can be a challenge worth facing instead of just a peace worth maintaining. And some of your people are going to remember what that feels like, and they are going to want it back." She had been absolutely right, and Valthrin knew she was right, and he could not write it in his report because to do so would be to acknowledge that humanity was not just a new species joining galactic civilization but a catalyst for its complete transformation. His report would be filed, and the council would read it and discuss it, and ultimately decide that humanity could be integrated through careful management and cultural education. They would assign monitors and advisors and establish protocols and guidelines. They would believe they could control the situation and manage the risk. They would be completely wrong about everything. Valthrin sealed his report and transmitted it to the council through the official channels. Then he sat alone in his research station, looking down at Earth and watching the lights of human cities covering the planet, like stars brought down from the heavens. Somewhere down there, humans were being born and living and dying and fighting and loving and struggling and refusing to quit. And he knew with absolute certainty that he would never stop thinking about them. He would never stop wondering what they would do next. He would never stop fearing and admiring them in equal measure. The Krell were supposed to be the galaxy's memory, and its record keepers and its historians. Valthrin had studied thousands of species over 300 cycles. He had documented empires that spanned entire solar systems and civilizations that had existed for millions of years. None of them had affected him like this small young species from an unremarkable yellow star. None of them had broken something fundamental in his carefully ordered mind. None of them had made him understand what it meant to refuse surrender even when surrender was the logical choice. Humanity had taught him something the galaxy had forgotten, that sometimes survival requires madness and sometimes logic must bow to will, and sometimes the only way to win is to refuse to accept loss. He would never rest again, not because his work was incomplete but because the work would never be complete. Humanity was still writing their story, and as long as they existed, that story would continue. They would continue and nothing would stop them. Nothing ever had, and that Valthrin realized was what truly frightened him. Not what humanity had done, but what they were capable of doing. Not their past, but their future. Not their wars, but their peace, and what would happen when that peace inevitably ended. Because it would end eventually. Humans did not maintain peace through evolution or enlightenment. They maintained it through choice, and choices could always change. He shut down his displays, and the images of human warfare finally faded from the screens. But they did not fade from his mind, and they never would. Keeper Valthrin had studied humanity's wars, and he would carry that knowledge for the rest of his long life. It was, he thought, a peculiarly human form of suffering. To know something terrible and to understand something dangerous and to be unable to forget it or escape it, but only to endure it. Perhaps he understood humans better than he had realized, and perhaps that was the worst thing of all.